Hi there, and welcome to the Kingdom Sexuality Podcast. We're Paris and Alana, friends who have a heart for intimacy and long to uncover God's truth and design for sexual freedom within marriage. Welcome here. Welcome back, Kingdom Sexuality. Alana and I, Paris, are here today, and we're going to be talking about a subject that can be pretty touchy, and that's not unlike anything else that we talk about, but
Shocker.
We're going to be addressing rejection today, sexual rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And Alana and I were just chatting about this, and we want to preface this by saying no is not wrong. We are not saying you can't say no. Do not get us wrong. There is very important time and places for you to say no to your spouse. We have talked about this a little bit in the past, and I want to preface this with Evelyn James. We love her and her content, and she came up with these 4 amazing guidelines. If you guys got our newsletter this month, you would have seen these. And it's that sexual intimacy should always feel safe. It should always be an outpouring of love to one another. It should always be mutually beneficial and always include enthusiastic consent on both parties, okay? So if you are saying no because one of these 4 things or multiple of these 4 things are not included, that is very important. Then you guys can address it. Have that conversation immediately. Please don't let it fester. We all know what happens when we let it fester. And then get on the same page and move on. The fight is never between you two. Remember that. So we wanted to preface it with that. So when we're talking about rejection today, we're addressing when you're just saying no because there's underlying stuff going on. Okay. And we want to talk about that. We want to talk about that gracefully, but we also want to be direct. Okay. So when we're talking about rejection, it's not about you, the one being rejected. It's often about them, the one who is doing the no's or putting up the stops. And we're going to explore both sides of the stories, you guys, okay? We're not going to just be like on one side and not taking the other. So if you're the rejectee, it can be extremely difficult not to take that personally. And we want to address that. I feel like so often than not, there's conversations going on about, oh, I said no because I'm too tired. Oh, I said no because of this. And I say no because of that. But we're not talking about the person who is constantly being shut down. And we want to bring light to that. Alana, do you have something to say on that before we take it further?
I mean, for like thinking even more about myself, I'm typically not the one who initiates 90% of the time. Normally it's Jeff that's, initiating intimacy. And so I know even when I'm thinking for myself, if there's a time when I've been like bringing it up and initiating with him, and if he's like, and actually I'm, this is going on, or, this time isn't great, can we do a different time or whatever? It's like, oh,
yeah.
Ugh. Yeah. Like it makes you feel kind of scummy. You're like, oh, okay. Like, I guess that's fine, obviously, but you're like,
but I can see how there, right?
Yeah. Like someone who is like always saying no to no and no and no and no. Like if I was to constantly be rejecting Jeff and being like, well, no, I don't want to right now. Or no, I have a headache. I'm too tired. Or you should have seen my day or whatever. It's like, I can see how over time that would really wear a person down.
Absolutely.
To not want to even ask anymore because you're like, well, why would I bother putting myself into that position if I already can have like a pretty good idea of what they're going to say if I ask?
Yes.
And you don't want that for your spouse. Like no one wants to like have your spouse think, well, why would I even bother asking her if she wants to have sex if I know she's going to say no anyway? Like that's pretty crummy. So I think it can be really valuable to, kind of switch it around in your mind and just really put yourself in your spouse's shoes before you say no. I mean, obviously, like you said, there are valid reasons to be saying no, but also to be keeping in mind, like, okay, why am I really saying no right now?
Yes.
And how would my spouse feel if I said no? And just, I don't know, even to have that as a conversation, be like, what, like, how does it make you feel? Like, how often do you think I, am saying no? Like, do you think I'm rejecting you more often than not? Or like, what, like have an open conversation about that would probably be really healthy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because bringing up a desire for intimacy is always putting your heart on the line. Like, it's such a vulnerable outpouring of yourself,
Yeah.
expressing that. And I want to also say, I don't believe that most women or most men are just saying no to say no. I think that there is an undercurrent of struggle or hurt or uncertainty or undealt with trauma. That's often what is coming out. So, like I said, we want to explore both sides of this and just look at rejection as a whole, and give you guys tools to deal with this together as a couple. Because, like we already said, you're not fighting against each other. This fight is not between you two.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, like we said, like when you're bringing it up to your spouse, you're saying like, hey, I love you and I need you. And I want this, two becoming one aspect, this reconnection of our union. I want the passion and the love, whatever, this fulfillment, like we said, that only you and your spouse can exchange.
Which is key.
And so when you're,
only you two. Yes. That's another thing we want to talk about yet and get deeper into.
Exactly. And so then for them to be dismissed and by hearing, I'm not in the mood or I'm too tired, like we said, what a sucker punch, right? When you're like, it can feel like really personal refusal. When you're like, oh, obviously it's me that's being refused right now. Like they just don't want me. Right. So then how can we then switch it? And, even if that is the case, like I know there's been times where I'm like, what, I am just like really, I'm too tired. Like I'm exhausted, like when you're just spent. And so, like, how can we portray that without saying,
it has nothing to do with
like, coming across as like, I'm refusing, like, I'm dismissing you and I don't want you, right? Like, how do you balance on that line, right?
That's so key. I'm so glad you said that because you're right. More often than not, it's not a matter of being like, no, I don't want you. It's not that. But the person on the opposite end often feels like that. So it's important to realize that. And like you said, these conversations need to be had. So the opposite of rejection is what? It's acceptance. It's welcoming, it's gathering in. So perhaps if you were to ask your spouse, is it your intention to make me feel unwelcome or unaccepted? Their response would probably be absolutely not. That is not what they want, right? But there is just a disconnect going on there in how you guys are addressing things, sharing things, expressing things.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe necessarily you're not being like, you know what, I don't want it right this like moment. Like other times when I've been tired, it's like, okay, well, I just right now is not okay. It's not saying that I don't want that eventually, but it's just saying like currently it's not really on the table.
Yeah.
So you're not really saying like, it's not like I don't want you personally. It's just, I'm just trying to, let's delay this activity, this, let's delay intercourse until it's a better time for both of us. It goes both ways, right? If your spouse is feeling spent, it's like, okay, obviously it's not a good time for this. It's not that it's not a good time for me. Like they don't love me any less. It's just that, right? So you have to really be mindful of that. It's not you. It's just, you need to just perhaps delay it into the time. But I also think it's really valuable to say, I'm feeling really spent. I'm, exhausted. And then give a specific time and date. Be like, okay, can we try tomorrow morning? Can we try in a couple hours? Like I think to leave it open-ended can be really dangerous. And it can get, when you get into that cycle of no, because it feels like that's what's going on. So if you are, specific and be like, okay, I'm kind of spent right now, but I really do want this. And I want to be intentional about having this time together. Can we just try it tomorrow night and we'll carve out some time together, really intentionally. I think it's really smart to plan it, even though you're saying no, but then okay, well then when can we, right? So that they have an expectation in their mind. It's not just, you're not going to say no forever.
Absolutely. I love that you said that. So it's a delay, not a dismissal. And that's really, really important for couples to relay within their marriage. Don't leave it open-ended, like you said. Set a plan in motion. Express yourselves to each other too. Like if your spouse is expressing to you that they want to be intimate with you, words can crush in that moment. So can actions. So let's maybe look at that. You know, like that saying, everybody still says it, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is so far-fetched from the truth. Like, that is so far from the truth. You know, even looking biblically, look in the scriptures, words have impact. What does God say in the Proverbs multiple times? Like, how much power we have in our words. You know, the life and death can even hang on our tongue. So for us to dismiss that and think that, you know, our lack of expressing things or being upfront or maybe just being human and really sucking in the moment and not conveying something, it does have an impact. It all has an impact, right? And it's so important for us to sit with that and really be like, okay, but what is the weight of my words holding on this person and on our marriage? And that's where I think, you know, self-reflecting is huge. And like you said, bringing those conversations onto the table is also huge. Like, what does it make you feel like when, you know, I've been saying no quite often lately? What does that make you feel like? Right? Or being able to be on the opposite end and be like, you've said no and I feel rejected. I know that's not what you mean. Can we talk about this? Because I really don't think most spouses mean to reject their spouse. I really don't think that. That's not what we're seeing here, you guys. But that's just often first nature, or like our first response in human nature is to feel rejection, right? When we put ourselves out there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you put up those walls instantly where you're like, okay, fine. Like, okay, great. Like, perfect. Whatever. Like, that's fine. You roll over, you go into the other room to do something different because you're like, you create distance instantly. I feel like whether it's like emotionally where you're kind of like, okay, well now I'm feeling slightly disconnected, or like physically you want like a little bit of space because you're like, well, I'm hurt. So yeah. And I think too, it's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, if you're the one who's like more often than maybe the other spouse saying no, it's like, okay, well, why? Why are we not, why am I saying no? And, you know, is feeling connection with my spouse and loving on them in the way, like we said, that only I can, you know, like kind of weighing that in your mind. And you're like, okay, do I say no right now? Or do I, you know, and not to make it seem like, oh, like you always have to say yes to your spouse because you want that connection. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, like, think in your, like, is what's going on in my life more important than my spouse feeling loved and connected to me?
Yeah.
And it's not to dismiss your stuff and saying that it's any less valuable, but marriage is servanthood. And like, that just has to come into play with things. And so I think if it's a matter of, okay, well, I'm just kind of exhausted. It's like, okay, well, you got to think, okay, well, how long is this going to take? Right? Like, you know, kind of plan is it going to be that long that, okay, if you stay up an extra 20 minutes, that it's going to then screw you up for the next day? Maybe not. You know, is the connection worth it? You know, I don't know. Like, I think you have to definitely weigh things in your mind.
Yes, which is huge. Like, being able to sit with yourself and ask those questions is going to make a huge impact on your marriage. Like, it really is. You know, I love that you said that too. Like, why am I not feeling up for this? Why has it been a constant thing where I'm just like, no. Lots of times there is some dirt underneath that needs to be dealt with. And it could be from something that your spouse did to you, and you're just having a really hard time sitting with that. It could be a lack of something going on in your marriage. You know, like we said, we don't believe spouses are just like, no, for no reason or just to be cruel. I believe that is the majority of people don't think like that. And so it's like sitting with yourself and being like, why? Also, if you're finding you're just plumb tuckered out at the end of the day, or you've just got so much going on in your life, it's just stress. Start taking action on that. It's stealing from you. The enemy loves distractions. What can you do to simplify your life so that this is not going to be in the interplay anymore? What are you going to do to protect the intimacy with your spouse in the evenings or mornings, whatever is convenient for you guys. What are you going to do to protect that space? That's also such a big deal. And I think oftentimes it's those simple things that we won't even have time to sit down and think about that. And we'll get so caught up in other things. Like, just bring it back to the basics. Am I protecting this? Am I seeing this with honor?
Yeah.
What am I doing to play into this so that it's possible and it's good? Right?
Yeah. And when you were saying that earlier, it just reminded me of like that whole emotional connection piece. If you and your spouse haven't been on the same page emotionally, and, you know, you have, you know, little fights or little things going on in the back of your mind, arguments that have been left unsettled, like, yeah, it's going to be more difficult to want to have intimacy when that emotional connection isn't there. And so we've done episodes on emotional intimacy, like that emotional connection. I'll link them below. I'm pretty sure we definitely have done one. Maybe we should do another one because it's just so important. Even the other day, it was funny. Jeff and I have been super busy. We're renovating a new house, an old house that we're going to be moving into this month here in August. And it's just like, it's so busy. It's such a busy time. And he was sitting on a chair and he just kind of pulled me over to sit on his lap. And I was like, what's going on? Like, why am I sitting here? He's like, I just wanted you to sit with me. I was like, oh, you just wanted to, like, because he knows, like, touch is one of my love languages. He's like, I just wanted you near me. And it's one of those things like, okay, I know then probably not that it's like I'm doing this so I can have sex, but it's just one of those ways that, okay, that connection hasn't been there. And so I noticed that he actually took the time to be like, no, I want to fill that need. I want to meet that need, because it's been totally a disconnect, right? And so I think thinking of your partner as your spouse's love language and keeping that in mind throughout your day is a simple way to be feeding into that emotional connection. Because then, I was like, oh, well, let's, that's great. Like, let's talk. You can actually have like a conversation because you're on the same page emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a huge aspect of it. Always, always, always. And we also want to address that, amidst life, there is big stuff that's thrown in the picture. There is sexual trauma. There could be emotional and mental trauma involved. There could be chronic illness. There can be pregnancy and postpartum and just huge changes in life, moves, work, high stress seasons. This indefinitely affects our libido, and it absolutely plays a different spin on the marriage. You go through new things and you have to grow through it, right? It's always a growth season. It's always a growth thing. So, through those seasons, there is often a lot more, oh my gosh, I just I can't get there on a mental level, right? I can't get there on a mental level. So please share that with your spouse. Please be open. If that's something you guys are going through, share that. Share where your headspace is at, where your heart is at too. And like we said earlier, make a game plan on how you're going to combat that to still pursue intimacy. It doesn't always have to be sex. So often everyone just thinks sex, and it's not just sex.
Exactly.
You can pursue intimacy in so many other ways. So get creative with it, but please keep intentional with it. Because when we're not, I feel like sex is definitely a foundational glue to a marriage. And when it's not there, you feel it. You feel it like so hardcore, and things just feel amok all the time. And it's important to also address that, like just have those conversations, you guys. It's such a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I think we need to normalize those conversations too.
Yeah. And like you said,
because so often it's like, doesn't happen.
And this is only something that you guys can give each other. Nobody else can fill in. It doesn't exist. This is something so sacred between the two of you. And that's important to keep on the forefronts of our minds.
So in your marriage vows, when you're saying, you're putting your spouse first, that wasn't just outside other people, that's yourself, whether you have bad habits, interruptions, or things that you're putting above your spouse. Maybe in the evenings, you guys are just sitting on your phones or you're watching television all late in the evening. I'm not saying this to like judge anybody. I'm right there with you watching Netflix too. Like there's definitely parts in my life where I'm like, oh no, look, things need to change. You have to create habits, like healthy habits. But I think to, step back and look at it and be like, okay, are we saying no because we don't want to, or are we saying no because we aren't prioritizing our time properly? And we're putting things, unhealthy things, before our intimate life with our spouse. And so maybe it's a matter of, having those conversations where you're like, hey, like, why don't we, a couple nights a week plan to go tech free and just keep it simple, whether we read books together, sitting on the couch or in our bed, or we'll play some games together. Like it's so bizarre how we just we can't live with technology. We can't live without technology. It's like this weird, it's got this grip on all of us, I think, to a degree, and navigating that. And it's, as soon as you put it away and you get the hum away, there's suddenly this deeper connection you can have with your spouse. I don't know if anyone listening goes camping, but for some reason, as soon as you're camping and you're out in nature and you're just enjoying quality time with your people, those are the times when you feel way more connected, emotionally and, even sexually if you're just camping with your spouse. But I think setting yourself up for success and your marriage up for success requires a lot of introspection. And it's not fun. And you really have to put a magnifying glass to your heart and being like, okay, what am I putting above my spouse? And like Kyle mentioned in our last episode, it's maybe, the guys listening are like, okay, well, maybe I'm putting activities outside of my home above my wife. And I'm realizing, oh, I should be prioritizing my family and her more so than things that are going on outside, hobbies and whatnot. And so whether it's sports or whatnot, there's so much other stuff they're good things, but if they're in the wrong level of our life, it's all wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, that's such a good point, because that's where it becomes an idol, right? All of a sudden, the order of what will cause harmony is disrupted, and everybody feels it on every level. And that goes back to, okay, let's examine the heart, you guys. Examine the heart, examine the heart, examine the heart, and have those conversations with your spouse.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, if you're like, okay, well, I'm the one who maybe I'm trying, I'm really working at this, I'm trying, but my spouse isn't. And your spouse is the one who's maybe has some habits. And we're not saying, we know this is a you issue. This is something you need to work at together as a couple. But Paris, what would your advice be to someone who's feeling stuck and almost trapped in that sense, that they're like, okay, well, I want to move forward, but how do I get my spouse to be on the same page as me? What would you say to that?
First thing I would say is get serious and go to war in prayer about that every single day. Intercede on behalf of your spouse and write that down. Write down what you're praying. Write those letters to God. And I think just having that intentional time you're setting aside to intercede on your spouse's behalf, and you're coming together in the Holy Spirit, you're moving mountains, whether you feel like it or not. And watch yourself start to just hope in expectancy as God moves.
Yeah.
It changes the playing field. It changes your mentality. And I think that is just, for me, that is where I always start. And if I don't start there, I backtrack until I start there. And I'm like, I should really be seriously bringing this to the Lord in prayer every single day faithfully.
Yes. Because I find too, if it's one of those things that you bulldoze in and you're like, hey, you're not doing your part. You're not showing up for me. You're not meeting this need. You're lacking. You're whatever. So holy moly, that's an instant wall, right? Someone's going to be like, get off my back. What's the problem here? So I think it's absolutely to be just the silent support in the background.
Absolutely.
Praying. Yeah, that's huge. I love that.
And then what would yours be, Alana? What would your piece of advice be on that?
I think it would require some honest conversations with really careful language to explain how you're feeling, because maybe your spouse just doesn't realize the depth of pain it maybe causes for you to have these longings that aren't being fulfilled. And so to bring that to your spouse really delicately, because you don't want to, like I mentioned before, like bulldoze and stomp on feelings, but to just come at it like really vulnerably and be like, hey, like I love you so much and I want this to grow and I want this to flourish, but I feel like there's these roadblocks in our way. How do you think we can combat this together to like get our intimacy to the next level? Because I think it's just requires really delicate conversations. And I think having a mentor, I think we say it every time, but having a couple that's more advanced in years, further along, you know, to pour insight in, because I think that's something that's really lacking, especially in men. I feel like it's rare for a man to be like, oh yeah, I got a great mentor session yesterday. Yeah. You're like, oh, cool. But for like a woman, it's like, yeah, awesome. Like, get it. Like,
it's like, why don't
like
you
that seems totally normal. So exactly. And so for a man for the men to find these people, like rally together, I don't know. I think having someone else being able to like being on the outside of the marriage, looking in, I think saying some of these things would hit home more than even it being your spouse, if that makes sense. To have someone pouring in and being like, hey, let's just take a mirror for a second and see how we're doing. So I guess that would be my advice.
That's so good.
And it's funny though, like we talk about this and it's like its own thing, like talking about like sexual rejection, but somehow it still comes back to communicating. Everything just comes back to communication. And so I think it just is so, I don't know. It's so, it's a good reminder to be like, okay, regardless of what's going on in our life, like whether it's you're struggling with sexual rejection or you're not, like you're struggling with spicing things up and trying new things, or you're feeling in a funk. And I think going back to communicating, laying your hearts out there, covering it in prayer is huge. Whether it's, you know, because you're feeling hurt because of rejection, things that are going on, or things from your past that are making you feel hesitant towards intimacy. Maybe like purity cultures, you're like, well, I feel like I need to say no because that's what I'm always supposed to say. Or now you get into it and now you're like, okay, but like now I can't say no. So there's so much all around it that having those really important and difficult conversations just need to happen. And like you said before, Paris, no one's going to have them for you. So you need to put on your big girl pants, put on your big boy pants, whatever it is, and just have those conversations, because your marriage is only going to benefit from it. So it's time to just do them already. Have those conversations now.
Hey friends, thank you so much for hanging with us today as we dive deeper into meaningful, godly intimacy, tackle the hard questions, and embrace truth while we're at it. We're also on Instagram. You can find our handle in the show notes alongside any resource links we mentioned in the show. As always, our hearts are to cultivate deep community and freedom with you guys. We are so honored to walk this journey alongside you. We'll see you in the next episode.